Please welcome the moderator for today's ESG session, Tashan Gunawardena.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the ESG session at the 2022 Global Financial Reporting and Valuation Conference. My name is Tashan Gunawardena. I'm a director in the accounting advisory practice in New York, where I help a variety of organizations navigate through the ESG journey. And it is a pleasure to be with you today and moderate today's session. We have a stellar lineup of ESG leaders from the firm today that are looking forward to sharing their insights with you. And with that in mind, let's give our panelists a warm welcome to the stage. Thank you for joining us. To kick off, and before we dive into the discussion, let's take a moment to just level set and align on the spectrum of ESG experience and expertise that's on the stage. Mark, would you mind kicking us off and just sharing a few words about yourself?
Yeah, sure thing. Mark Golovchenko, happy to be here as a longtime New Yorker. Any escape to Miami is most welcome. But also happy to talk about the very politically uncontroversial anodyne topic that is ESG. I lead a team of people with a wide-ranging background spanning renewable power, infrastructure project development, sustainability, strategy, and M&A, and we primarily do four things for clients. One is all things decarbonization, so measuring emissions, helping report emissions, setting targets around emissions, helping reduce emissions. Secondly is climate risk, assessing the impact of long-term climate risk on companies' business models and their financials. The third is what we call ESG strategy, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And the last thing is we do a lot of M&A related work that is increasingly incorporating ESG and climate considerations as well.
Okay.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Kate Lee. I'm a partner in our accounting advisory practice, and I'm also one of our ESG national reporting leads. I actually sit in LA, so normally Miami's similar weather, but I actually left LA in a hailstorm the other day, so definitely happy to be here.
Mike Hoyt, I'm a principal in the Houston office. I lead our power and utility and renewable valuation team nationally. I will note that over dinner last night, or the night before, we did have a case study in sustainability around stone crabs.
Oh, that's good.
Just saying.
Hi, everyone. My name is Bryce Earhart. I'm a managing director in our professional practice group. I'm located in Denver. Recently moved there from New York, though, so kind of new. I spent a lot of time working with the regulations in the U.S. and internationally. I've been having a lot of conversations with clients about how to approach them. Patrick was just mentioning, like, what do you need to do now? So that's kind of really what my group is focused on right now, is helping companies understand how they're potentially exposed to these different regulations from the SEC and internationally, and trying to kind of digest those a little bit. So happy to be here with everyone.
Amazing. All right, so considering the cross-functional expertise that we've got on stage, let's first take stock of the evolving ESG regulatory landscape. Starting with you, Bryce, I know that we've got the SEC climate rule and that it's imminent. When should we expect that to be finalized, and what type of challenges could there be from the proposed climate rule? Bit of a tricky question.
Yeah. I mean, it's a logical place to start, I suppose, and it is kind of the elephant in the room whenever you talk about ESG with U.S. companies. I will give a prediction. I'm probably not as good as my predictions as Sean was, but let's baseline first, right? In March of this year, the SEC released their proposed climate rules. They're really focused on aligning with the TCFD, which is the Task Force for Financial-Related Disclosures. They have a bunch of recommendations. They did a really good job of aligning there, but they went above and beyond in different areas. Some of the hot topics are greenhouse gas emissions reporting, and it required Scope 3 reporting. Scope 3 reporting is reporting on emissions that are associated with your business indirectly. So those could be emissions that are associated with products you purchase, raw materials, for example, companies you invest in, policyholders you underwrite to, et cetera. You heard just before we came out, again, I think again from Patrick about the data issues. There's a lot of data challenges around Scope 3 reporting. The other area that's quite a hot topic is within those proposals that came out in March, they actually proposed essentially a new note to the financial statements, which basically was trying to articulate how you take a climate-related matter and how it affects your financial statements. I think we'll talk about that a little later. But essentially, there's proposed to be a new note in the financials to kind of articulate that about how climate-related matters affect the company. So that all happened. It's gone through a public consultation phase. I think over 4,000 unique responses came back, a significant volume that the SEC staff is working through. And weirdly enough, probably about a month ago, there was a technical glitch that the SEC called. And basically, they did not feel confident they had a complete population of all of the comments that were responded to. So they reopened for a couple of weeks. So we're in a phase right now where we have a lot of, just like we're here, there's a lot of other events going on. We have the SEC commissioners out speaking on these different topics, but really there's not much that's coming to fruition. So we're kind of in this wait and see period. So with that being said, what do I think is going to happen with the going from proposal to final, right? I think I mentioned the GHG emissions. There's a lot of questions about whether or not they're going to keep Scope 3 emissions reporting in there. My guess is that they are, but they're going to include some revisions, maybe like practical expedients or limitations to it. The reason I think that is because there's a significant interest from the SEC and from other international organizations to try and find some sort of global baseline. And that's kind of what's on this slide, trying to show what that baseline could potentially be. But the ISSB and EFRAG, or what's happening in the European Union, they're going to require Scope 3 emission reporting. So, if the SEC does want to maintain some sort of baseline, they'll go with something like that, but they'll probably scope it back somehow. The other area is the financial statement note, right? I think there will be something that maintains from the proposal. I think one of the challenges is going to be what is deemed material to go into that note. Some of you may have heard of this 1% bright line materiality threshold. So basically what the proposal said is, okay, if you have a climate matter that you think is going to affect your financial statements, look at the financial statement caption that it's going to affect. And if the value is greater than 1% of the amount of that financial statement caption, then it's material. That's pretty granular. It's different than the typical materiality definitions that the SEC has used in the past. So there's been a significant amount of pushback on that. So I think we'll see that either get raised or go away, and they'll focus on the principle-based approach to materiality. But I do think something will stay in there. What also is interesting, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, but in the EU, they just came out with, they basically just submitted a draft of their draft proposals for climate. In there, they also require quantifiable effects on the financial statements. But they said you can disclose that qualitatively for the first 3 years. So this may be somewhere that we see the SEC go as well and say, okay, you got to do it in the note, but you can do it qualitatively for a few years. Again, trying to make sure that there is some sort of alignment there. From a timing perspective, when do I think it's going to come out? I think the SEC would love to be able to tell a story where they say, okay, we proposed in March 2022, and we got the final out by March 2023. And for a while, I thought that was going to happen, but most recently, we have 2 new commissioners that just joined. They still have that Democratic majority, but they need to work through making sure that those 2 new commissioners are on board. So that'll take time. And we also just recently had the FTX bankruptcy, which throws crypto back into the forefront, I suppose. So I think the staff is spending probably more time than they wanted to on that right now. So that's probably going to delay things a little bit. I've personally heard estimates everywhere from January to late summer, but I think it'll probably be sometime in late spring next year that we'll see something. So that's my prediction.
Appreciate that, Bryce. It was the first question, and like you really unpacked that first box on the
There's
slide.
a lot.
with the SEC.
I'm trying to
What a journey.
preempt the questions.
No,
A lot
I
of
appreciate it. No, it's detailed. Appreciate it.
Yeah, so there you go.
Mike, do you have any other insights that you want to add to that, or any other thoughts?
Yeah, I do believe that companies out there are concerned about the burden of disclosures. You know, anytime new disclosures come out, there's some angst around how much work is going to be necessary to comply. I also think that they're having a bit of a struggle because there's some requirements, especially around the scenario analysis, that may require skill sets that aren't there immediately, which has translated into, you know, an involvement of these new chief sustainability officer type roles. We're having to kind of find a new matrices of employees that can kind of do this work because now you're trying to weave together scenario analysis, emissions, calculations, and then how that impacts your financial statements. All of those things are fairly difficult, but I think at the end of the day, the SEC is trying to find a level of comparability. I think the only thing that I could kind of compare it to is, you know, when the SEC kind of came out with their final rule around extractive companies, where they were kind of trying to modernize oil and gas reporting. And what they were doing was saying, hey, we know that PV10, and for those of you who don't know what PV10 is, it's present value at 10%. They were trying to standardize the way you look across reserves, proved reserves for oil and gas companies. And what they were doing was trying to give the investors some tools so that they could say, hey, these companies are a little different, but if I'm just trying to look at this particular aspect, I can compare them and do it in a good way.
Thanks for that, Mike. So maybe let's take a step back then and take a global perspective on what's happening in that ESG regulatory landscape, and also referring to the slide here. I understand that the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive in Europe was recently finalized, and also that the ISSB is moving at pace to establish that global baseline in sustainability reporting. Bryce, could you walk us through the latest developments from Europe and how it impacts US companies? And thereafter, Kate, would really appreciate your insights regarding the latest developments from the ISSB.
Yeah, sure. And try and be a little bit more quick here because you probably want to hear from Kate and not me. But I will tell you, I'm having more conversations with clients around the developments in Europe right now than I am over the SEC or even the ISSB right now. And I suppose it's timely because we don't have something from the SEC. But in November, there was a flurry of activity that came out from the European Union, and to me personally, it was overwhelming. It was hard to maintain what was happening. But what's happening in the European Union, we need to look at what's happening right now. So right now, EU companies that are in scope have to do non-financial reporting already. They have to report on the matters that we've already been talking about. But that only affects about, I think the estimate's like 10 to 12,000 companies in the EU. Now what's happening is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive was just formally approved by the European Union. That's referred to as the CSRD. And it's going to significantly expand the scope. I think the estimate's over 50,000. That does not include non-EU companies that can get pulled in. I'll talk about that in a second. Now, the other thing that just happened in November is EFRAG, the European Financial Reporting Advisory Group. That's the group that was basically delegated the task of creating the disclosure requirements. So the SEC created their proposal, EFRAG's creating the CSRD proposals. They submitted their first batch to the European Union, the European Commission, for approval. There's 12 different standards. That's only the first batch. They go into much more detail and they focus on each topic individually. So they have a standard for climate, pollution, biodiversity, et cetera. So that's kind of what's happening right now. From a non-EU company perspective, there's two ways to get pulled into this thing. The first is you have a subsidiary in the EU that is, meets the scope. And if it meets the scope, then it has to comply with the CSRD. The second is if you are a parent company that does enough business in the EU, one of your subs will be required to file a consolidated report on your behalf. And that's where we're having a lot of conversations, because we have a lot of multinationals in the US, and those multinationals have a lot of different legal entities, a lot of different parents that roll up into other holding companies, et cetera. And so several of the conversations I've been having is, okay, I have 100 different legal entities. I need to figure out which ones are in scope for this. And then what if my parent's in scope, or one of the parents within my organizational structure? How do I think through that? What we're finding on more than one occasion is that the consolidated reporting capabilities within an organization are not aligning with the consolidated reporting that would be required under the CSRD. And I'll give you one anecdote from a conversation I had last week. I was on a call with the legal, sustainability, and financial reporting groups of a client, and they said, I really hope US companies are starting to wake up to this, because it's a significant problem. So anyway, that's kind of some of the conversations we've been having. We do have a thought leadership piece out on this topic that, I think you had my contact info, so if anyone's interested in it, feel free to ping me, and I can share that with you.
So the last of the three proposals that are out there is coming from the ISSB. So the ISSB is the International Sustainability Standards Board, which is actually the sister organization to the ISB for those that are IFRS filers. And they've issued 2 exposure drafts so far. One is what they're calling sort of the general requirements exposure draft. This exposure draft was designed after IAS 1, for those that might be familiar with that. So it covers things like presentation, completeness of sustainability disclosures, as well as things like changes in estimate that you might find in IAS 8. But there's definitely a focus around identifying what are the significant sustainability risks and opportunities for an organization. And the plan is to release additional exposure drafts covering different topics, but the one that they have released so far is related to climate. So that's IFRS S2. And again, really similar to the SEC's proposal, which is, heavily leverages TCFD. So there's a big focus around identifying what your significant climate risks and opportunities are. But then also they're really interested in understanding what metrics and targets are important to an organization that you think might actually affect enterprise value. The other thing that the ISSB proposal is heavily focused on is understanding who's actually responsible for these programs within an organization. So they want to understand governance, controls, what's the risk management process like. And so again, very similar to the SEC proposal, but one of the things that, when you step back and think about the CSRD proposal, which, as Bryce said, certainly the large European-based national companies are preparing for that now, because they know that's going to be a mandatory disclosure. I think what was a big light bulb moment this year was that US multinationals that have a European subsidiary are finding that they need to get that European subsidiary ready for these CSRD requirements as well, which was, kind of surprising for many US-based companies. And then when you think about that, along with these ISSB proposals, we are feeling this really, a lot of companies that we're talking to are feeling very compelled to at least start, if not make a lot of progress this year and next year on sort of their ESG strategy and reporting.
Awesome. So let's now think about each one of these frameworks and that considering that an organization would have to at least comply with one of these frameworks. Mark, would you be able to talk a little about what kind of sustainability related strategies organizations would need to think about in order to actually achieve success? Hearing your insights regarding like best in class strategies or practical experience from helping clients across various industries, really insightful.
Yeah, sure thing. As an aside, if you are drowning in the alphabet soup of frameworks and standards and regulating agencies, I sympathize with you. It is not easy to get your arms around this stuff. So I think what we've seen from working with clients in terms of what is success in terms of getting going on ESG collapses into basically 3 steps. One is mapping your world, right? Understanding what ESG topics, and there's a wide, and this is one of the challenges with ESG, but there's probably 40 or 50 topics that could fall under the umbrella of ESG. And so what are the ESG topics that matter to you as a business, given your industry, given your stakeholders, and collapsing that universe of ESG topics into the ones to focus on. The second one's probably a little bit more obvious, is within that first step, it's of mapping your world, is what are the topics, how are you doing on those topics, and then most importantly within that first step, where's the value within those topics, right? How those topics impact you from a value perspective? Some topics, particularly on the E side of ESG, have real cash flow implications. Could be good, could be bad. Some topics on the G side are really hard to sort of tie back to cash flow, but connecting ESG to value, I think, is an important step in terms of making ESG real. So the second step is on those ESG topics that are material, and this is not the financial interpretation of materiality, but on those ESG topics that are material to you, what do you want to do about them? Do you want to lead? Do you want to follow? Do you want to just monitor? We have some clients that are very aggressive in decarbonizing their businesses a lot of times because their customers are forcing them to do it. We've got clients that have Microsoft as a customer or Target as a customer, and these the big Fortune 100 companies, Fortune 250 companies are pushing their oftentimes private suppliers to decarbonize as a gating factor in getting more business from them. So for those ESG topics that are material, what do you want to do about it? And you don't have to necessarily be progressive on every ESG topic that is material to you. And then the third thing that we see clients doing well is really what we would call embedding ESG into your operating model. Organizing around ESG, there are named chief sustainability officers amongst the Fortune 500. I think it's up to about 125 named chief sustainability officers in the Fortune 500 now. Are you going to have incentives around ESG? Are you going to incorporate ESG into your planning processes, whether those are CapEx processes or strategy planning processes, and things like that? And one of the many challenges with ESG is the inherent cross-functional nature of ESG. It touches finance and accounting and operations, and historically used to sit in a corner of corporate communications until it became much more mainstream. But how you sort of wrap the operating model around ESG is the third step.
Amazing. So having already covered off on the road to compliance and the strategies that we're seeing out there in practice, let's pause for a second just to see if there's any questions in the room, either in person or virtually.
We have a question over here.
On the virtual platform, but if someone in the room wants to go first.
When you disclose your emissions, do you disclose them net of RECs that you may have purchased?
That's a really good question.
Yeah, I can take that.
Different.
So you would not, it depends on the framework. I'll just say generally, the expectation, I think, is that you wouldn't necessarily report them net, but you would have the capability to say, okay, this is my gross, and then these are the RECs, carbon offsets, whatever, to get to like a net number, basically. So you would have to show it gross, usually. Sorry? Charged.
Judged.
Judged. Well, that is up to your stakeholders and the general public to decide, I suppose. I mean, and this goes to kind of how you tell your own ESG story, right? To me personally, and Mark, you can probably say a few things on this as well, but there's value in having control over your own story, right? If I wanted to go research the ESG strategy of a certain company, I couldn't really find it, I could hire a firm to go out there, cull the internet, find whatever information they can get, and bring that back to me, and I can judge that as I perceive it to be judged. But if a company can manage their own story, they have control over what's out there and how a group can perceive them. So that's one thing I think we spend a lot of time with, right, Mark, is making sure that a company knows how to approach their strategy and how to manage the stakeholder communication around it. Because to your point, maybe you do have a heavy Scope 2 emissions profile, but you're buying all these RECs. If your key stakeholders, whoever they may be, doesn't need to just be investors, right? If they don't know that, then the story is totally different than how you want them to perceive your organization.
Yeah, I would just double down. I think it depends on who's doing the judging, right? From an investor's perspective, you're spending money on your renewable energy credits. And if you stop spending that money there and you're going to try to lower your Scope 2 emissions, you're going to have to spend money elsewhere. And so I think it does depend somewhat on the stakeholder who's doing the judging of those REC disclosures.
And I guess just one thing to add, it's funny that you bring this up because this was actually a topic the ISSB was talking about, and how you think about the impact of how you disclose and when you report your RECs on your financial statements, because you actually do purchase those, and that actually does flow through your financial statements. And so there's this interconnectedness between your your climate disclosures and also what's actually showing up in your financial statements. So there's a lot of discussion right now on how those two should interconnect, and when is the correct timing of recording those RECs and flowing that through the kind of core financial statements as well.
This is really interesting, and thinking about now the next topic and the broad range of stakeholders that we've just mentioned, let's switch gears and talk about how ESG is now impacting valuations. Following on from yesterday's session with the US economic update, there's a looming recession, and I hear that ESG is also having further implications, I should say, for finance and valuation professionals. What are your thoughts on that, Mike?
Yeah, I think the word of the day is stakeholder. I think when we think about stakeholders, I probably kind of bucket them in three pieces. I'd say investors, lenders, and management. And when you kind of look through those different lenses, you're going to get different interpretations of, how you're meeting your need. I mean, there was just an article yesterday about the fact that a number of these companies that have made declarations around being net zero were still not achieving net zero, even though they had significant investments in renewables. So they'd have to kind of take a different tack and maybe even actually invest in renewable assets, as opposed to maybe some of the financial aspects like RECs or other things to kind of offset. So it all depends on who your stakeholder is. And from a lender perspective, they're going to be looking at what are your emissions? Is your output creating emissions? Are you offsetting that output? Are you producing RECs? And obviously you're in a great position if you're producing RECs, but are you producing enough RECs to kind of offset your actual GHG emissions? So those things are going to be kind of in the near term, kind of the face of the platform for a number of management teams out there as they try to kind of go through the process of implementing their ESG profile and contemplating what this reporting looks like on a go-forward basis. I really think that the activist investors out there are driving a lot of the churn right now, not to mention the fact that we're actually kind of looking across the pond and seeing what's happening in the UK and in Europe more broadly, and seeing what types of disclosures are being required. And when you get kind of into from a technical perspective, you know, in terms of management, we talked about the fact that there's the scenario analysis that's going to kind of go into this measurement. Having to kind of coordinate that, bring that together with your financial reporting is going to be difficult. It's going to be a task because I think, like Mark was saying, there's a number of different aspects of your company that have to come together to kind of gather that data and actually leverage that data for output. From a valuation perspective purely, I mean, you kind of break it down into two pieces. There's your PFI, or projected financial information, and then there's the discount rate. Which one of those really needs to be adjusted to reflect your ESG exposure? I'm leaning towards PFI because I think that's where management has the greater insight. You know, the discount rate is a tool that can be used, and generally there's components of the discount rate that already measure what's happening in the marketplace. So, you know, adjusting your discount rate might be duplicative. So I think that making those adjustments in your PFI, using Monte Carlo type simulation analysis to evaluate your PFI, that might be the way to go.
And let me jump in and crystallize some of what Mike was saying, and I'll just paraphrase a recent discussion with a private equity client. And in this context, we're talking about ESG. We're going to narrow in on just the climate or the carbon side of ESG. Basically, he said, look, if we're looking at two different businesses, and they're basically comparable businesses, but one is attempting to and making progress on decarbonizing, and the other is not, would we pay more for the business that's attempting to decarbonize, and by how much? And that's the crux of the issue, and you're seeing that play out increasingly in the private equity space as they're looking at buying businesses and attempting to bake in the cost and the timing of decarbonizing the businesses they own in looking ahead to when they sell the business 3 to 5 years down the road. And there's a concept called carbon adjusted EBITDA even starting to emerge, where you're backing out regulated carbon costs and unregulated carbon costs and efforts to decarbonize, which is starting to emerge as well. So long-winded way of saying is this sweet, ESG and climate in particular does hit valuation. People are circling around how to factor it in. It's easier said than done. But there's definitely a consensus that it needs to be accounted for, incorporated into valuation considerations.
It's interesting to see how ESG is creating like layers of complexities for organizations to have to navigate through. Let's take another perspective on that and take a look at some recent statistics from KPMG's 2022 CAO survey. Now, for reference, the total sample size of the survey was 360 respondents and included CAOs from a wide spectrum of industries. So first up here, we have 85% of CAOs say that their accounting and finance functions have already or are currently assessing how the emerging ESG regulatory landscape will impact their company's financial reporting. Kate, do you have any initial reactions to that? What do you think?
Yeah, Tashawn, I mean, that's pretty consistent with what we saw this year. There was a large wave of work done over the course of the year to try to understand and get their arms around whether or not some of these proposals really, impact organizations. I think the really interesting thing is that it was the accounting and finance team, not necessarily just the sustainability team, but really a cross-functional team. And a lot of times it was led out of the accounting and finance office, the controller's office, that they actually went ahead and did their own assessment of how these proposals are going to affect an organization. I think one of the things that they are finding, which kind of we'll get to here in a minute, is the types of information and the processes and the data that underlie some of these very public statistics made a lot of controllers pretty nervous. As Mark said, the sustainability statistics at one point were sort of tucked away under perhaps the legal office or, another function within the organization. But the really interesting shift that we saw this year is that the controller's office is the one that really understands the rigor and the discipline, and what it takes to really feel comfortable disclosing information in something like an SEC document. So they're at the table, they're doing their own assessments, and they are finding that data and processes are an issue.
Interesting. So let's take a look at the second statistic. But before we do that, if we can take a quick poll by a show of hands in the room, who is confident in their ability to accurately collect data and report on ESG? Got a single hand up in the room. Okay. Because based on KPMG's CAO survey results, 60% of survey respondents are in fact confident in this regard. Bryce, do you think, given that we've got 0% in the room, could there be a disconnect here, or could there be something else in the 60% that we want to unpack here?
Yeah, I mean, I could play devil's advocate here and say if I were in an organization, right, I'm in the controllership group, financial reporting, whatever, if I know what data I need and it's over here, and I'm over here, I have processes and controls to go get that data. So maybe that's what's coming through here. But to what Patrick was saying earlier, right, the biggest question is, where is the data, right? At its heart, ESG is a data challenge. When we think about what's really unique here, from my perspective, is these different regulations that we've all been talking about. Obviously, we're trying to report on how something impacts my organization, but what gets scoped in is your entire value chain. And you're intended, through these regulations, to report on different activities that are technically outside of your legal remit, right? So how are you engaging with your suppliers or vendors? What types of companies are you investing in? Those types of things require data from those outside third parties. And to some extent, for like GHG emissions, maybe you can just use some publicly available data and come up with some sort of estimate and call it a day. But that's not going to be the way for much longer. We're going to have to start engaging with these third parties to go and try and find this information. And we see that right now. We see companies, larger companies, basically telling their private suppliers and whatever the other alternatives we've said, going to them and saying, okay, I need data A, B, and C, and I want you to make sure that you need to give me confidence that what you're giving me is accurate, credible, and reliable. So we even see some large companies saying, you need to give me A, B, and C, but I want you to provide limited assurance over it or something like that. So, and that is definitely the trend where it's going to go further. So it's the sourcing that is a significant challenge. When we get to actually, running it through the processes, this is kind of where, to me, breaking down silos is critical between sustainability groups and financial reporting and controllership groups, and even valuation for that matter. Because what we have here is we have a lot of things that have been going on within organizations previously. A lot of organizations have already done sustainability reports or ESG reports, but they haven't put a rigorous set of processes and controls over it. And that's because it hasn't really moved into that finance function. So one thing we have a lot of conversations with clients about is, how does the controllership group get engaged? And it seems obvious, at least to me, because we have the expertise here, right? We have a process of going through a financial reporting close and getting information from point A to point B in a confident and reliable way. And that type of experience needs to coexist in the sustainability world. So I think that's a really important point of how to get involved and how to kind of break down those silos, which historically, at least in my experience, sustainability people and like finance people haven't worked too much together, but it's becoming more important now.
So taking a look now at the right-hand side of the slide here, I can imagine that there are a lot of executives and board members whom typically have that finance and accounting background, may feel a little overwhelmed with what the governance structure will need to look like, or what other considerations would need to be put in place when you start thinking about ESG-related risks and the linkage then to the financial statement impact. Now, I recognize that KPMG has this 5-step overview for boards to really consider, but Mark, would really appreciate your thoughts regarding how boards can really engage and govern around ESG topics.
Yeah, sure thing. First, to your comment, I do think, stepping back, this is a huge training and educational challenge, not just for boards, but for management teams. We talked about the challenges of Scope 3 and managing your supply chain. Your typical procurement person is used to dealing with price and quality and payment terms, not used to managing for sustainability issues their vendors. And that's just sort of, one example of the challenges ahead as this becomes more of a mandatory regime. From a board perspective, right, a couple thoughts. One is, the boards, in as much as they function as long-term stewards of value and they are intermediaries with investors, right, that gives them a license to engage on ESG and climate in as much as we think it's going to impact the value of the company. It's going to require, again, education and training just in terms of getting boards comfortable with it, but they certainly have a license to engage with management teams on the topic in as much as we think climate in particular is going to impact value. Second thing, again, and I just mentioned it, but we're moving from a primarily voluntary regime to a mandatory regime, and that, again, that gives the boards a license to sort of weigh in. We are oftentimes, in serving clients, a client will reach out to us, and this has happened on many occasions, and they'll say, look, the board has asked the management team, what are we doing on ESG? And then I received, the CEO got that request, and then I got the request from the CEO, and now we're trying to figure out what we're doing on ESG, right? So that simple trigger from the board oftentimes spurs action, and things start moving from there. But those are a couple thoughts on engaging from the board level.
Appreciate it. Now, let's take another moment just to pause and go around the room to see if there's any other questions, either in the room or virtually.
Hi, thanks. So given the measurement difficulties that we've discussed, how are companies thinking about reconciling the ESG proposals out of the SEC with the pay for performance proposal?
Yeah, I can take that one, or at least start. Okay. So right now, the SEC's proposal is really focused on climate. And I mean, there are other areas within the SEC's requirements outside of climate where they talk about remuneration. So they are intended at this point to be completely separate. Now, what will be interesting, which triggered in my mind when you had the question, is there's human capital proposals coming from the SEC as well. They've been working on these for years. I think they were technically expected to be proposed or released at the end of this year. I don't think that's going to happen. But that as well, I think, is intended to stay away from the pay for performance, but it will go into things like workforce diversity, health and safety policies and procedures, et cetera. But at this point, I think how the SEC is going to approach the whole ESG spectrum is in a piecemeal way, which is different than like what Kate mentioned, it's how the ISSB and how the European Union is approaching it.
Any other questions?
I think we had another question over here.
Yeah.
So yesterday, Europe just announced that they're going to put pollution prices on imports.
Yep.
The thought is, at present, it's more on material goods. What happens if they move that also to services? And the reason is, I'm from real estate, and so the question I have is, if I'm going to develop a brand new building, office building, it'll take me 5 years, starting today, or 6 years to get it. Will there be a future where I should consider the cost of building, let's say, a carbon neutral building? It'll cost me 25, 30% more, or 50% more. And the payoff, is that because we build buildings that's 30 years, 40 years. Will there be payoff where I can say I can charge 30% more rent to BlackRock, to KPMG, because they want to show that their carbon footprint is lower, and services industry, majority of their carbon footprint comes from the office buildings they occupy, I think.
I mean, I'll jump in and say, the short answer is yes. We're already selecting hotel vendors based on their carbon footprint of their hotels, and airlines based on that as well. I think you're going to see more and more an incorporation of, whether it's explicit or implicit, the cost of carbon into not just border tax adjustments like you're seeing in Europe, but also into the price of services like what you're saying.
So just a follow-up. So there is a project, for example, I'm advising on. Can KPMG tell me where is that my breakup point? Because it can be pretty expensive, really, truly. If you get into the material, then I can start using recycled wood or cement that's made by low carbon stuff. And so, I mean, my price can even double if I want to really, truly create a carbon neutral building. So the point is, I know that these are extreme cases, but can KPMG or anyone say that this is where your risk reward lies? Go this far, you'll have captured, since these buildings are being built for the next 50, 100 years.
Precisely, we cannot tell you. Directionally, I mean, you can start to, and this is, you see explicit costs of carbon in some marketplaces, which are getting baked into services and goods as well, and you can, and you can sort of directionally get to an answer. But precisely, we can't tell you an answer. But yeah, suffice to say that all things being equal, we would choose a preferred hotel vendor for KPMG. All things being equal, we would choose the one that has a lower carbon emissions profile because of our own KPMG goals for reducing carbon, and we'll pay more for it.
I think one aspect that I'd follow on with is in the consideration of your economic model as you're contemplating your project, there should be some thought about tax. And I think tax is kind of playing in the background of ESG, but there's a number of different incentives that came out through IRA, and I know that was discussed a little bit on the panel beforehand, and IIJA. Both of those two tax opportunities are kind of paving the way with pay-fors for a number of the things that you're considering.
Appreciate that. Joe, any questions from the virtual audience?
Yeah, there was one. It's been some time has passed since that question was posted, but it was related to private companies. And I think you touched on it a little bit around customer pressures and so forth. But what are we seeing out there from what are private companies doing with respect to adoption?
Got it. I'd say the answer is going to be anchored in, and as a starting point to understanding how an SEC registrant supply chain is integrated and how they really consider the proposal in that lens. Bryce, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I can start, but if anyone else has any thoughts. So I talked about the ESG story. So we talked to a lot of clients, private companies that are trying to figure out how to manage that. We talked about how really private companies get pulled in through the data collection efforts of public and larger companies. Another thing that's kind of interesting is we're kind of entering this new era of reporting, and doing this type of reporting almost becomes table stakes. So at least from an operational perspective, like if you think about the financial reporting world, most companies in here, your management reporting basis is US GAAP. But if you have international, subsidiaries, and you're doing business overseas, most likely you have to do some sort of statutory reporting that is not US GAAP. In most cases, it's IFRS, for example. We know that most countries that are applying IFRS are also going to apply ISSB. So if you want to continue to do business in those countries, then it's most likely that you're going to have to file a statutory report that is IFRS from a financial side and ISSB from a sustainability side. So that's another angle that is kind of the table stakes. I think maybe, Mark, you could talk to the point about how From a financing side, you know, we're starting to see interest in, you know, diligence processes where ESG is coming and engaged in that. So from a project side, or sorry, from a private company side, just looking for financing or lending, to your point, these types of ESG elements are being incorporated into those types of processes as well, regardless of size, right?
Yeah, I think on the private company side, right, and they're not going to be, obviously not going to be subject to the SEC rule, but we see this time and time again. They're getting pressured by their public company customers to essentially do many of the things that are incorporated into the SEC climate proposal, starting with measuring your emissions, right, and starting to put a dent in your emissions. And so I think, and that's, I think, partly the theory behind the SEC proposal is, we'll push public companies, they in turn will push their customers, and we'll impact the private markets via the public path of action. And as a result, right, one of the side effects is, as we sort of mentioned earlier, you're seeing increasingly this thing. It is a thing now, ESG due diligence or climate due diligence, as public companies look to acquire private companies, or as private equity funds look to acquire private companies. They are doing due diligence, increasingly attaching this form of due diligence to their traditional due diligence work streams to get their arms around what is the emissions profile of a private company if they have not yet measured their emissions. What is, again, we talked about this earlier, what is the cost and timing of decarbonizing once we buy this business, so we can figure out how this is going to impact our combined financials and our ability to hit the targets that we set. So there's a lot of ways by which this is sort of working its way around from public companies down to the private company space.
And one other point, I've had conversations with private companies that are considering voluntary complying some of these, including the SEC's proposed rules, because they're concerned that in the market, the sentiment is going to be public stakeholders are going to think more negatively of them if they're not complying with these rules, but then their peers who are public and have to comply with this are doing it. So there's kind of that just general sentiment type of strategy to Mike's point about stakeholder communication and management. What do they want to see from you?
Yeah,
Okay.
maybe just to add one last thing to Bryce's, certainly for any companies that are looking for a public exit, it's definitely, I think the theme of differentiation has come up around, can I use this to really, can I really use my ESG story to my advantage? And we definitely saw that certainly in the 2021 sort of, market, but even now as companies are, starting to prepare for an IPO, there is a lot of discussion around, hey, this is going to be really core to my equity story. And, we need to start really crystallizing what our ESG strategy is. And that's going to be a key part of the IPO.
Great. As we now start to wrap up, what does this group see in the road ahead? How are we seeing companies really position themselves for the myriad of ESG reporting requirements and consider the respective financial impacts? Mark, starting with you, what do you think?
Yeah, sure thing. So I am consistently struck in dealing with clients how few of them, even amongst the public companies, have yet measured, how few of them have actually measured at least even their Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. And I mean, I think the one consistent factor between the SEC climate proposal and all the other frameworks is you're going to have to measure your emissions and potentially disclose them at some point. So I think the call to action, from my perspective, and clients continuously underappreciate how hard it is to do this. Measuring emissions is not in the wheelhouse of most companies. It's kind of a different muscle, a new muscle to sort of exercise. So the call to action is to start measuring your emissions, Scope 1 and Scope 2.
Kate, what do you think?
Yeah, I think one of the things we're really seeing companies position themselves to get ahead of this is around mobilizing their teams. So there's just been a really significant impact on sort of people related to ESG. There's been an expansion of ESG reporting roles, ESG controllership roles, director of sustainability roles, and I think that's one of the things that we're definitely recommending to clients is really thinking about the cross-functional team that is going to, actually actions, gathering this data, putting in place these processes. So Mike, maybe.
Yeah, I think, on the horizon, I see a lot more of the non-traditional players coming into the market, specifically non-traditional going into renewables. There's just a host of incentives there to kind of push that. I mean, whether you're talking about the actual core renewable technologies like solar and wind, or if you're talking about energy transition from a carbon capture or open air, other technologies that have been extremely fruitful, like under 45Q and some other tax credit incentives. So I expect to see the transition happen more broadly, whether we're talking about oil and gas companies or technology companies.
I probably should have started with this, but can we do another show of hands? How many people in here work for an organization that has exposure to Europe, do business with Europe? And what about other international markets outside of Europe? Okay, so quite a few. So one thing that I think is quite important is if you're in Europe, right, figure out which of your legal entities are in scope of the CSRD. And once you figure that out, you need to look at what your options are from a consolidated reporting perspective. I think that is a very important action that you can take right now that can save you time down the road. The other thing I would say just generally is there is a future state that we need to get to, and that is some sort of regulatory compliance with sustainability reporting. And for a lot of you in the room, you're going to have to do at least 2 of these frameworks, SEC, CSRD, and ISSB. Now, you want a future state that is one single streamlined process. And so there is some right to left thinking that needs to be done here around what are the commonalities in these proposals. And you want to create a process and put controls in place that leverage as much of the commonality as possible, and then you kind of have these top-ups or kind of like extra adjustments that kind of go above and beyond to achieve these additional areas of reporting. So that's kind of the things I would say is work on the baselining, and then if you are in EU, try and get a handle on what your scope and exposure is there.
I couldn't agree more. From my perspective, I would like to underline a comment that was raised earlier around how ESG is not just a compliance exercise. It is an opportunity to undergo profound transformational change, to unlock value for all of your organization's constituents, and also build a competitive edge. But with that, I wanted to thank everyone in the panel, and also to you all here in the room here in Miami, and also virtually for attending. Included on the slide here is a couple of resources that we thought was relevant and would help guide you on your journey. But if you wanted to have a tailored discussion, feel free to reach out. We're going to be taking a short break, and we'll be back at 10:35 Eastern with our next session regarding M&A related insights. But until then, please enjoy the rest of the conference and take care. Thank you.